got to minimize the game here. Sorry. Be sure your sins will find you out. So one time, my dad, he has moral qualms with playing with a normal deck of playing cards. Like he'll play Uno, he'll play Skippo, but like when he grew up, that you weren't allowed to do that. So in college, I started playing poker a lot, and I started doing that. So I bought my own like chip set, like the big briefcase full of chips. So I was bringing that home, and I met my dad on the porch. I'm like going up my porch, like trying to hold it behind my back. Maybe he'll think it's a gun case or something. And he's like, "What are you doing?" I go, "Nothing." And all of a sudden the entire like suitcase falls open, like poker chips roll everywhere. They're falling through like the cracks in the deck, like they're still under there to this day. Like I never did find them all. And then all he said was, "Be sure your sin will find you out." And he walked away. So kind of learned my lesson that time. I want to continue. If you guys were here Wednesday, I started talking about King Saul, and eventually we're kind of getting to King David a little bit. And the message, or the heart of the message, is the heart of King Saul and the heart of King David. And it's having a soft heart toward God and having a heart after God. And specifically in the psalm where it's after David sins, after he sins with Bathsheba, he writes Psalm 51, and that's "Create in me a new heart," or a clean heart, renew a right spirit within me. Don't cast me out of your presence. Don't take your spirit away from me. I still want to have that fellowship so I can be a witness, so I can turn unrighteous people away from their evil ways, and that's the cry of his heart. And I think that should be, as I was moving away from the fruit of the Spirit, I want to continue this with that heart and to kind of be looking as Christians, what should our heart be like? What should we be looking like? And it was interesting that Pastor Kim was talking about fear, because that's kind of the message tonight a little bit, is just how we deal with fear in fearful situations. So I'm going to start with a quick review if I can connect here. But so we went through King Saul, kind of when he was and was never God's intention to have a king and then have a government set up like other countries around, that they'd be taxed, that they'd have to give a portion to that king, that they'd let God be their ruler through the prophets, through the judges, but they wanted a king, so God gave them a king. It's on my end, not their end, Zach. But here we go. So quick review. I want to be talking about a king's perspective, or what it should be. So on Wednesday, if you guys remember or weren't here maybe, I did a little quick timeline for you because I'm doing that for something else, and I was having fun with this, but give or take about 1000 BC is what we're talking about. A lot of archaeologists didn't think that King David was a literal person. They didn't think he thought he was figurative. They did find some archaeological evidence with a plaque saying King David and referencing him. So we do have historical proof of his life. And then I had the verse, "All things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose." It wasn't ever God's intention to have a king, but God still gave them a good king, picked a right king for them, and he chose King Saul. Then we talked about his many failures and his many sins along the way. And after his first major sin, God says, "I'm going to raise up for me a man after my own heart." Let's see if I can find that. Got too many slides. I think this is it. So he sins, Saul sins, and Samuel says to Saul, "You have acted foolishly. You have not kept the commandments of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not endure. The Lord has sought out for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has appointed him as ruler over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord has commanded." So after Saul sins, and he has several of them, this is like the first big one, where he didn't trust in the Lord, didn't trust the commandment, didn't obey the word of the Lord. His posterity wouldn't reign, and instead God was going to raise up somebody after his own heart. So process of time happens. We have Saul becoming king. And then the word of the Lord comes to Samuel. Let's see. There we go. And the Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you mourn for King Saul because he wasn't following in the steps of the Lord? Since I have rejected him as king over Israel, fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king." But Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hears about it, he'll kill me." So he tells Samuel, bring a goat. Just if anyone asks you, say you're going to be bringing a sacrifice. And then it's kind of funny. It's the perspective that people have if a prophet shows up. This verse is really interesting. So Samuel did what the Lord said. When he arrived at Bethlehem, the elders of the town, they meet him at the door and say, "Do you come in peace?" Like, prophet of the Lord, there's two things that are going to happen. Either good news. More often than not, it's like, you've sinned, here's what God's going to do. And they're like, whoa, what are you doing here? We didn't know you were coming. This wasn't scheduled. What's going on? Do you come in peace? Like, we know we haven't, they're probably thinking of every bad thing they ever did growing up. My dad had this habit growing up. He'd always be like, "Jim, come over here. I need to talk to you." I'm in trouble. I did something wrong. I'd be like, I'd have friends over. We'd be in the middle of hanging out or whatever. He'd be like, "Need to talk to you right now." Okay. And I'm like, does he know about this, and this? There's no way he knows about that. Like, and I'm going through, and he's like, "Oh, I just haven't talked to you for a little while. Like, how's it going?" I'm like, "Now? You want to do this now?" Like, made zero sense, but every time in my head, I'm like, oh no, what did I do wrong? So that's kind of what the people are thinking, like, okay, God knows everything I did wrong. Now he told Samuel, and now we're going to get punished. So here's what's happening. Samuel replied, "Yes, in peace. I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come to the sacrifice with me." Then he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. So as we know, Jesse is the father of David, and this is God calling Samuel to anoint David. So when he arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord." And the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." As we know, Saul was somebody very tall, very handsome. He was a Pastor Tom, as we found out Wednesday. In some respects, he was a head and shoulders above other people. He was goodly in appearance. He was a good-looking guy. And Samuel's probably looking for the Saul 2.0. He's probably like, okay, this isn't work. Someone just like him. So he starts seeing Jesse's sons. Oh, this guy's tall. This guy's strong. He can cut it. This has got to be it. So I love this verse. "Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." So what is God looking for? We know from earlier it says God is calling someone with a man after his heart. That's what he's looking for. The physical appearance isn't what he's looking for. It's the heart that is what he's looking for. So Jesse doesn't even bring David to the table when he's going through all his sons, so he finally has to send for David. So verse 12 says, "So he sent for him and had him brought in. He was glowing with health and had a fine appearance and handsome features. Then the Lord said, 'Rise and anoint him. This is the one.' So Samuel took the horn of oil, anointed him in the presence of his brothers, and from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David." So there's something about that anointing. It's probably different, but the best way, I always picture like being filled with the Holy Spirit, but it had to be different in the Old Testament. This is pre-Jesus, pre-Pentecost, so what that looked like, but God's presence went with David and probably affected his heart, his perspective, the way he saw things, the way he, something changed because the Spirit of the Lord came upon David. And, we have that picture. He goes down the line of all these brothers, and finally he's like, God said no to each one of them, and finally he chooses David, the one that nobody expected. And now this is the other side of it. So the very next verse, it says the Spirit of the Lord fell on David. Very next verse says, now the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. So we talked about that a little bit, where Saul had sinned, he's done these things, he took the kingdom from him, and finally this judgment of God comes and says that my spirit's not going to be on Saul anymore, and now the Spirit of the Lord went on David. Very next verse, now the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul. Whether that departed from Saul and went to David, it sure kind of seems like that, where it's like God has anointed somebody for this position to lead his people. He has an appointed person that he wants to lead and guide his people and his entire kingdom. And even though he wanted to do it other ways, he's stuck in this rubric of a government, of a king, and he has to have the right person for this. And he anoints David, and his spirit comes upon David, and it leaves Saul. And the irony here is that Saul's attendants then say to him, see, an evil spirit from God is tormenting you. Let our Lord command his servants here to search for someone who can play the lyre or the harp. He will play, and when the Spirit from God comes on you, you will feel better. So then they choose. So they hear about David. So now the one of the servants answered, I have seen the son of Jesse of Bethlehem, who knows how to play the lyre or the harp. He is a brave man and a warrior. He speaks well and is a fine-looking man, and the Lord is with him. So whatever that means with the Lord being with him, people that hear about him know this about him. It's very evident when people meet him and see him. He's a warrior, he's a good-looking guy, he's a brave man, and the Spirit of the Lord is with him. That's a pretty good reputation to have. Sure. If four things were to be said about somebody, those are four pretty good things. He's brave, he's good-looking, he speaks well, and the Spirit of the Lord is with him. That's a pretty good resume right there. So then the next big challenge that we have is we have the Philistines coming, and we have Goliath the giant challenging Israel. What's interesting here is not only how David rises to this challenge, but how Saul abdicates his position. Yes. It's Saul's job as master and commander of the armies to repel this invasion. It's his duty to either raise somebody up, call on somebody, or go fight this battle on his own. God has given him favor numerous times to wipe out the enemies. He did it to the Amalekites and the Ammonites. The Philistines rise up, and this big, tall giant comes, and this is some of the description that we hear of him. He's a champion named Goliath. He was from Gath, and he came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. Some people say like 9.5 feet, give or take. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. No idea how heavy that is. It's probably heavy. On his legs, he wore bronze greaves, and the bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. So this spear was probably like this big around, and like he was just massive proportions, a very intimidating warrior. And the reaction from Saul, then the Philistines said, this day I defy the armies of Israel. Give a man and let us fight each other. On hearing this, the Philistines' words, Saul and the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. That's why I thought it was so interesting when Pastor Kim talked about fear and how we respond to situations. The Philistines come, this giant comes and says, all right, I'm going to challenge you guys, send somebody out one-on-one if you don't want to face the army, because their army was probably intimidating where they didn't even feel their army was able to defeat them. And what Saul does, he looks at his army, he looks at the stature, he looks at the size of his spear, he looks at everything in that verse ahead and says, I can't do this. And every other person is saying, I'm not able to do this. And they're absolutely correct. They're not strong enough to do it. They're not a good enough warrior. They're not going to be able to overcome this giant. David's back tending his sheep. He's a shepherd, and all his brothers got drafted into war. So now his dad sends them with some food. Go check on your brothers. So he goes, And this giant's been coming out every single day for 40 days, challenging, blaspheming, and making fun of the army of Israel. And then David finally hears it. And then, so David's there at the camp, and he hears this giant, ranting out there. And finally he comes, and David asks the men standing near him, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" Right there, David has a different perspective than the rest of the Israelite army, than King David. It's not, what is this person against God? Saul says, what's this person against me? I'm not big enough to do this. I'm not strong enough. And God never comes into the equation. He never thinks, the Lord delivered me here, the Lord delivered me here, surely the Lord would deliver me again. Never crosses his mind. What does David think? Who is this uncircumcised heathen coming against the army of the Lord? Like, who does he think he is? He doesn't stand a chance against God. Why is this happening? So David, this little kid, comes out, and his perspective is not this giant against our soldier. It's, what is this giant against God? It's a completely different perspective that he sees. David says to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." Saul replied, "You are not able to go out against the Philistine and fight him. You are only a young man. He has been a warrior from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When the lion or the bear came and carried off his sheep from the flock, I went after it. I struck it and rescued the sheep from its mouth. And when it turned on me, I seized it by the hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God, and the Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." So, who knows what kind of lions live in Israel? None do right now. What kind of bears live in Israel? None do right now. So some geographic things changed, some temperatures and climates changed, population shift. There were bears and lions there even in the 1200s, about 800 years ago. There are probably variations of an Asiatic brown bear and kind of an African Indian. The only place the lions still exist are a small population in India today that were there. These lions could have been 600 pounds and 9 feet long from tail to head. They were very big, probably even bigger. 1800 BC, there probably would have been bigger animals, more forest, more land. They were probably even bigger than what we think of lions today. The bears were probably much bigger than what we think of a bear today. The bears that were there could have easily been 600-700 pounds, 9 feet tall, same thing. So when he's comparing this giant to these lions and bears, it's not some coyote that he's scaring off with a slingshot. These are big things, and we hear a lot about lions and bears in the Bible, but it's kind of hard to picture them because they haven't lived there in probably close to 1,000 years. So it's, from our perspective, it's a little bit removed, but from theirs, that's something that he dealt with on a regular basis. And what's interesting, too, is that God was preparing David for this moment, and he never knew it. In his time as a shepherd, something in his heart was developed, something in his character was developed to protect his sheep. Didn't matter what it was. And then I love his perspective. He doesn't say, I killed this lion, I killed this bear, I can kill this giant. He said, the same God that delivered me from the lion and the bear will give this giant into my hand. It's not me versus that. It's God through me versus this thing. It's a completely different perspective than that of other people. I was talking to my father-in-law the other day, and he's a truck driver. He drives semi-truck. And he told me about this article that was kind of comparing the way people are to sheep. And he said people even drive like sheep because one car does it, the other cars will do it, and we'll get in little packs. then there'll be 2 miles of no cars, and then there'll be this little cluster of cars again. And I was like, I do that exact same thing, because I was driving up to Cumberland the other day, and this big old camper was like stopped on a 2-lane trying to turn, and the car in front of me like goes way off into the ditch, swerves around it, and normally I would have just stopped behind it and waited, but the car ahead of me did it, so I was like, I just took it at like 25, and I'm like, as I'm doing it, I'm like, why am I doing this? Why am I going around in the ditch? Like, this is stupid. But I'm like, oh, the car ahead of me did it, so I thought it was okay. And I get halfway in, I'm like, I got 6 inches of room on either side here. So I went by, and I was like, it was fine. But it was funny, as soon as he told me that, I was like, yes, I see, monkey see, monkey do. I watched somebody did it. Oh, I can do that too. And that's kind of what we do. And we don't like to think of ourselves like that, but the reality is, we copy what we see. If we see people afraid, we tend to get afraid. If people run over here and they're just running for some reason, we'll run for some reason. If people dress a certain way, we'll dress a certain way. We just copy what we see. And so in that, really, the Israel and managing these sheep and protecting them and leading them, those same skills translate to what God is going to need in a future king, and that something rises up in David. He has the Spirit of the Lord on him. He's brave. He doesn't back down from things like other people. And he said, the same God that delivered me from the lion, from the bear, that are probably not that much different in size from this giant that he's facing, he will deliver that into my hand as well. So then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened his sword over his tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. He said, I cannot go in these. And he said to Saul, because I am not used to them. He took them off, and then he took his staff and chose 5 smooth stones from the stream. He put them in his pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with a sling in his hand, he approached the Philistine. So once again, what is Saul's perspective? He finally says the right things. Oh, the Lord go with you. But then he's like, well, he's got armor. Let me give you armor. It'd be like McCoy trying to dress up in Pastor Tom's clothes. It's just not going to work, you know? It's just not going to work. But still, this is the perspective of Saul. He thinks, he's coming with armor. I'll give the best armor, then maybe he'll have a chance. If I do the best thing money can buy, maybe we'll have a shot at this. He still doesn't have any faith in God. He's still not recognizing that God can deliver him. He's still not recognizing where the war actually is. He's thinking, well, this guy's big. I'm pretty tall. Let's put this is probably the biggest set of armor they have. If King Saul's this tall, we'll put the biggest armor on him, and maybe they'll have a shot. And David's like, this isn't going to work. This isn't what I know. This isn't what I was trained in. I'm going to do things the way I've done things. And we all know how this story ends. And the reason we remember it is because 99% of the time in situations like this, David loses. The giant comes against any normal person. The giant usually wins. And that's just the reality of it. So we have this story, and we like to think, oh, the underdog has a chance. But sometimes we don't look at why the underdog won in this scenario. And it's not the underdog winning in this scenario. Right. It's God winning in this scenario. Right. And David's perspective through the whole thing is, who is this guy coming against God? God delivered me before. God's going to deliver me now. It's never, I can do this. Oh, I've killed a bear. I've killed a lion. I can kill this guy too. I'm pretty good with a sling. I could take this. You never see that. It's always, God can do this. He's coming against God. He has no right to do this. This is God's army, and he's some heathen. He has no chance against God, and that's always the different perspective. One other place we have from Numbers, and we have the same perspective happening. We have that same story of people being intimidated by giants. We have the spies going into Israel. We have Joshua and Caleb and these 10 other spies representing each tribe of Israel. They're going into the land of Canaan, spying out the land of Canaan. In school, we used to sing the song, 12 men went to spy on Canaan, 10 were bad, 2 were good. You guys remember that one? So if you, we always had these action songs. I can't remember all of it, but we always had this song and going in, and we always hear that, 10 were wicked, 2 were righteous. Joshua and Caleb went in. And they all go in, they bring some giants' grapes back and all the stuff, and then the people hear about the giants in the land. they get afraid. They start rebelling against Moses. Moses doesn't know what to do. And finally, Joshua and Caleb stand up in front of Israel, and this is what they say to the entire Israelite assembly. The land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. And if the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into the land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and he will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people in the land, because we will devour them. Their protection is gone, because the Lord is with us. Don't be afraid of them. So these are the sons of Anak. They're giants. The other spies said, we ourselves see ourselves as grasshoppers in their eyes. They were giants of stature. Goliath was probably somehow a descendant of some of these giants years ago, so this is a lot older. These giants were probably much taller than Goliath, probably way taller than 9 feet tall in reality. But he almost equates being afraid of them with rebellion of God. He says, this is what God has said. We're supposed to go into land. This is what God has given us. Don't rebel against God and don't be afraid. It's like, where is your faith? Look at what God has done. And then all the Israelites, they start complaining. They said, oh, if only we had died in the desert. If only we could die back in Egypt. Why would God lead us here just to be killed here? And it's like, oh my goodness, wake up and smell the coffee, see what's going on here. And finally, these people, Joshua and Caleb, they have the right approach, and they say, their protection is gone. The Lord is with us and not with them. We have nothing to be afraid of.
That's right.
And it's the same correct perspective that David has against the giant. It's them coming against the Lord. Against the Lord, there is no chance. So a couple things we see. Wrong title on the top. I should say conclusion, but I was editing it from my previous slides. So a couple things through this story. We see early on that God's Spirit was no longer on Saul, and it rested on David. And David's life as a shepherd, there was preparation built into that he didn't even know was happening. I remember times in my life where I've looked back and thought, what am I doing here? Why am I in this job? Even working at a bank and finance and stuff. And then years down the road, it's oh, this is exactly what I needed at the time and didn't know it. God's preparing you for something, and sometimes you don't even see kind of what it is. But the biggest thing is when the Spirit of God came on David, his perception and perspective of things changed. All the Israelites and King Saul, they saw this giant and they cowered. They were filled with terror and they were afraid. They could not do it, and they had the right perspective, and they couldn't defeat this giant on their own. But they had the wrong perspective in seeing this isn't me versus him. This is God versus this puny giant. It's a completely different perspective. So David did not fear the ungodly intimidation, and that's typically what it is. Yes, this giant was strong. Yes, he had probably an impressive resume, and he was a skilled warrior. But the biggest threat here was the intimidation and the fear. The entire army was afraid of this one man. And we hear stories, David's mighty men are slaying several giants. They go through and kill all his brothers, and the Lord is delivering them into their hand. Not to mention in the history, the land they had was taken over by the giants talked about in Numbers, where they had that same fear, and the Lord delivered the entire land of giants to them. And now one of them comes back, and it's oh, we can't do this. Yeah. And it's don't you remember that this land you're now occupying was once occupied by giants bigger than this? And it's the fear that sometimes puts us in a place where we don't have that trust and we don't have that faith in God. We start looking at, I can't do this. I'm not strong enough to do this. What am I going to do? And we don't stop and say, but God's got this. Yeah. Compared to God, this is nothing. Compared to his power, compared to his faithfulness, this is going to be no different than anything else that I've faced and that God's delivered me from. So David saw things from God's perspective. When the Spirit of God came upon David, it changed his perspective on how he looked at it. So if he's a man after God's heart, he also had his vision and perspective. He saw things the way God saw them, not the way the rest of the Israelites saw it, not the way King Saul saw it. he saw it the way God saw it. He saw it as an affront to God. He saw it as one giant against God and his army, and he never had a doubt that God would deliver this giant into his hands. And we see through the whole story, how did Saul see things? It's the way sometimes we fall into seeing things. We think, I can't do this on my own. Well, maybe if I get him the best armor, maybe if I do everything I can and try really hard, I'm going to be able to do this on my own. Maybe I can, be resourceful enough to work a way to do this. And he doesn't trust God to deliver it. He doesn't say, what is this compared to God? How will God work this out? Or even, pray and trust in God. You never see that from Saul, and you see that from David here. So this perspective, the way he sees things is different. And God's preparing David to be the king. He's anointed him, but he hasn't taken that role on yet. But God's already using him, already allowing him to, work and do his plans and protect Israel. He's already acting more like a king than the king is, and he doesn't even hold that position yet. But God's put that in him. God's called him to that. So sometimes it's another lesson here. God's called us to things and put something in our hearts and prepared us for something, and we might not have realized that yet, but it doesn't mean we can't act like that. So he's already been anointed. He's already had that oil poured on him. The Spirit of God's already on him. He doesn't hold the title. He doesn't hold the crown. He doesn't hold the wealth. He doesn't hold the authority in man's eyes, but God already gave him that authority. And then when someone rose up against the king of Israel and all the armies, that was King Saul's job to stop him. That was his responsibility. He couldn't cut it, but God used David to do what the previous king could not, because the Spirit of God was upon him. So I want to encourage you, if there's something God's put in your heart that hasn't been realized yet, just because you don't see that, or just because the physical circumstances aren't there yet, that ground can already be taken in the Spirit. You can already act as if that's been accomplished, because that thing will work out. You might be in a preparation stage like David was for a long time. You might be muddling through things. You might be like Elisha in the field plowing dirt, waiting for Elijah to come, and kind of seeing that. It is for a time you feel like, what am I doing? Why am I here? Why am I doing this repetition? Why am I doing the wax on, wax off over and over and over again? And you don't quite see the merit to it, but God does preparation on you even though you don't see it yet. And that's another lesson to be learned from this story. So I want to just conclude with that tonight and let you guys get out of here a little bit earlier, because we got some snow falling out there. So Pastor Tom, you can close.
And perspective is all throughout the Bible. Abraham, is anything too hard for the Lord? Moses, I can't speak to him. Yes, you can. Hey, what's that in your hand? The three Hebrew children. We're not going to bow, and we're not going to burn, because even if you throw us in the fire, I have a perspective. God is able to save us out of that. And perspective is all throughout the Bible. And, if we're wise, we want to catch on with God's perspective and just see things from his point of view, because here's the reality. We can do all things through Christ who strengthens me.
Still says that.
And in our puny little minds, we have all these reasons, or maybe just even one reason why we can't. But if God calls us to do something, then surely we can do that. That's just the promise of his word.
Ask Cody to
Okay.
do that. Cody, back there on YouTube, Building 429 has an awesome lyric video, Fear Not. We're totally into lyric videos on Wednesday night. I'm sorry for you guys. Yeah, so you have to search it up. Is it 429 or 492? 429. 429. And it's the lyric video.